Welcome to this webinar of the Jerusalem Press Club, JPC, with Rabbi Yehoshua Pfeffer, head of the Haredi Israel division at the Tikvah Fund. We'll speak about the Haredi, Ulthra-Orthodox community in Israel and the coronavirus. For those of you who are here for the first time, you can watch the previous webinars with Professor Arnon Afek of Sheba Hospital and Daphne Aliel, Knesset correspondent of Channel 12 on YouTube. You will get a link to this webinar immediately, and it will also be on YouTube very quickly. We will create a WhatsApp group for this series, so you will always be in the loop if you wish. And stay tuned for tomorrow. At 4 p.m., we'll run our next webinar with Muhammad Daraushe of Givat Haviva on the Israeli Arabs under the coronavirus, public health and politics. If all goes well, Minister Tzarich will join us with another one at 6 p.m. So stay tuned for all of this. I want to thank my colleagues at the JPC for facilitating this webinar. Rabbi Pfeffer will start with a short introduction, and then we'll open up for Q&A. You are on mute, so please type your questions, and Rabbi Pfeffer will answer them. Rabbi Yehoshua Pfeffer is head of the Haredi Israel division at the Tikvah Fund, born and educated in London before continuing his Torah education in Israel. He has written numerous books and articles on different subjects of Jewish law and thought, and has taught at several yeshivot in Israel, currently at Chedvat HaTorah. He's also served as chief halachic assistant to the former chief rabbi of Israel. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree, summa cum laude, in law from Hebrew University, and clerk at the Supreme Court of Israel, also teaching at the Hebrew U and Herzliya Interdisciplinary Center. Rabbi Pfeffer, please.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, much longer than necessary. Anyway, I'm happy to be here and to be able to make a short presentation. I'll really be happy to take questions, but I'll give a very brief introduction. Obviously, Haredi society, which often in English is known as the Ulthra-Orthodox, is no less vulnerable to the coronavirus than other Israelis or other members of the human race. This is very much the case, for example, in New York, where some of the greatest levels of infections is among the Ultra-Orthodox, among the Haredi society. The kind of risks that will especially apply to Haredi society is because of their very strong communal nature. Haredi Jews are very particular about going to synagogue and davening, meaning praying, holding communal prayer to God in large groups. It's a part of their religious commitment. In addition to that, they live in sets of large families and very close-knit communities. That's true for Israel, it's true for New York, it's true anywhere. And this kind of communal lifestyle, where many families are, number one, large themselves, and number two, get together frequently alongside mixing with one another in the synagogue, children playing outside and so on, just leads to a lot of human interaction that can lead to a lot of infection of the virus. In the present case, in the current scenario, so we had a Jewish festival of Purim a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of the initial outbreaks came from these kind of Purim festivities of large gatherings getting together, whether it's with a rabbi, whether it's as a community, whether it's as a number of families coming together and actually spreading the virus very, very efficiently by means of these communal gatherings, which are very particular to religious Jews in general, but to the Ultra-Orthodox in particular. Now, I'll make a couple of comments beyond that. That's in the communal sense. But there's also a certain, I would say, nuance or a certain sensitivity concerning Haredi society when it comes to compliance with government regulations. Haredi society in Israel has an ambivalent relationship at best with the state of Israel. For some Haredim, the state of Israel was kind of born in sin. These are the more extreme versions of Haredi society. They claim they were here, some of them were here before the state of Israel came along, and therefore they don't have to play by the rules of the state of Israel. But even for the more moderate Haredi society, which is the vast majority of ultra-Orthodox society in Israel, nonetheless, there's an ambivalent relationship with Israel, because Israel is a Jewish state on the one hand, but it doesn't espouse the version of Judaism that Haredi society would like to see going on in the public sphere, and even in their own communities. Some of the Israeli regulations and laws and so on are seen to be inhibitive or restrictive of the Haredi way of life. And therefore there is a certain ambivalence between Haredi society and the state of Israel. This is a long story, and it goes back to the foundation of the state, and even before that to the early Zionist years. And I won't get into the whole story here, but to cut a long story short, Haredi leadership and Haredi society, or at least large parts of it, sees Haredi society itself as a kind of state within a state. There's the state of Israel, but there's also the Haredi state, in inverted commas. There's no real Haredi state, but of course, there's a certain mindset of independence. We're not going to blindly accept any kind of instruction or directive that's coming from the state of Israel and its various bodies, especially when it comes to religious observance and matters of religious observance. This is something that Haredim have fought with the state of Israel over decades when it comes to education, when it comes to questions of religious freedom of religion as the Haredim understand their own freedom of religion, when it comes to the public space in Israel and the purity or the religious pristine nature. Pristine is a high word for this, but to try to protect the public space, at the very least, where Haredi people live, from interference, from the kind of I guess you would call it, from the Haredi perspective, contamination that can happen from Western culture. And therefore, Haredim are very sensitive to any kind of interference with what's going on internally in their communities. So when the regulations were initially made of, for example, shutting down schools, so the Haredi rabbinic leadership said, 1 second, we're not shutting down our schools. Our Torah schools are a religious matter. They're not just a civic matter of education, but they're a religious matter of Torah study. And therefore, we're not going to accept lying down state directives of shutting down schools. We're not going to shut down our yeshiva institutions, which is a higher institution for Torah study. We're not going to shut down our mikveh, which is a ritual, a bath for ritual immersion, where many men go there often. For women, it's a different issue, but many men go there often, and we're not going to shut those down. That's a religious matter. It's a question of religious affairs. We're not going to accept directives from the government concerning religious affairs. Even last night, and this is remarkable, even last night when the new regulations of the Israeli Health Ministry were being discussed in very long discussions that went through the night, then Health Minister, this is the Minister of Health, Yaakov Litzman, he's the person that's most in charge of the health of the Israeli population, not the Haredi population of Israel. And he petitioned the Prime Minister Netanyahu to exempt the synagogues from the new regulations that prohibit or that regulate people leaving their houses without a good justification. So Health Minister Litzman said that synagogues should be excluded from these new regulations, and people should be allowed to continue praying in synagogues, even though we know that synagogues are a significant factor in spreading the coronavirus. So
excuse me for interrupting, but just newly released data shows that 24% of all infections come from synagogue.
Well, yeah, that data is still somewhat questionable. Even the data itself says that it's 24% of known infections, meaning 24% of the infections that we know where they're coming from. There are many, many infections that we don't know where they're coming from. And there's a lot of discussion about that data, but one way or the other, it's a significant factor. And the fact that the health minister is trying to exempt the synagogues comes over as being very absurd. But that has two reasons. One reason is because of this kind of dual loyalty. There's a loyalty to the state, but there's also a loyalty to the internal community norms. And the other thing I would perhaps emphasize or underscore is that for Haredi Jews, for the ultra-Orthodox Jews, the established religion, rather than a personalized religion, is key. It's something which is it's part of the DNA of what it means to be an ultra-Orthodox, a Haredi Jew. Being a part of the establishment, being a part of a group identity is a religious tenet. It's a fundamental part of religious life. So the kind of request or the kind of raised eyebrows from other Jews, including religious Jews, who are saying, what's the big deal? Just pray at home for a few days. For the Haredi individual to pray at home for a few days, even though it might be religiously acceptable, halachically, meaning in terms of Jewish law, it might be an acceptable alternative. But from the Haredi perspective, which is very much a communal method, a communal way of religious observance, of serving God, which comes together with a package deal of identity with a community and its norms, it's very, very difficult for Haredi society to come to terms with closing down the yeshiva institutions, with closing down the Torah academies, with closing down the synagogues. All of this is extremely difficult for Haredim to come to terms with. And even after they'll be closed down, I can put money on it. Many, many, many Haredim will continue to hold communal gatherings for prayers outside, wherever they can. They won't just take their prayer home and say, now is a time to have a more personalized religion. Because in the ultra-Orthodox mindset, in the way that they see things, religion is very much a communal affair. It's very much a question of serving God collectively, together with the entire society that represents Haredi life in Israel. So this makes the safety precautions, the regulations, that much harder for Haredi society to accept. And I'm working personally to try to, help as many people as possible understand that this is what we must do at the present moment, that everything must bow its head before the need to curb the spread of coronavirus, and also to take responsibility beyond the boundaries of our own Haredi group, and to think about the well-being of the entire nation, the entire country, indeed the entire globe. But this concept of a civic responsibility is not something which Haredi society is necessarily used to. They're used to taking responsibility for themselves, but less for the entire population. And I think here there's a certain moment, it's perhaps an auspicious moment, perhaps, where Haredi society is being called upon to really take that responsibility and to somehow change or refine its mindset concerning its relationship with broader Israel, generally speaking, and with the government also specifically. I'm going to leave it there, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Okay, so guys, you're most welcome to place your question. Let me ask you something, Rabbi. You talked about the collective nature of the Haredi community and of their difficult, sensitive relationship with the Zionism, with the Zionist state. But there's something that comes from religion itself. I mean, the Torah decrees, "V'nishmatem me'od lenafshotechem." Be very careful about your lives. So why don't they follow this instead of listening to what the government is saying?
Well, first of all, that's a very good question. And I think, again, the answer has to divide into two. The question of v'nishmartem, but when you mean the question of taking safety precautions to guard one's health, is often, it's often perceived as a personal question. This is something which we need to treat each person individually. What is the safety regulation that you need to take? The vast majority of halachic material concerning the question of v'nishmartem is personal. It's about taking precautions for yourself. In this case, the question of a nishmatim becomes communal. And that's something very new. And it requires the Haredi leadership to strike a balance between the everyday religious duties of going to the synagogue, of communal prayer, of Torah study, of the yeshivot, and of the schools, and so on, of striking a balance between those which are traditionally considered to be the highest calling of Haredi society, and with this new calling, which is very, out of left field. It's very unusual. It takes some getting used to. Now, for the government and for Israel, broadly speaking, it's much easier to get used to this. Yeah, this is something which it's a state of emergency. We have to close down schools and we have to stay at home, and we're not going to do sport, and we're not going to go to the theater, and we won't go to the cinema, we won't go to the pubs, and we won't go to the restaurants. For broader Israel, that balance is an easier balance to strike. But for Haredi society, it's very difficult for them to strike that balance. And they're going in stages. It's a too slow process, but slowly but surely they're getting there. At the beginning, 3 weeks ago, so the Haredi approach was, come on, they're not going to tell us what to do, and there's no way we're going to shut down the yeshivot. We've come a long distance since then, as gradually the gravity of the situation sinks in, penetrates the Haredi mindset. But that's taken time, and time is really of the essence here. So we've come a long way since the beginning. We've come a distance since the beginning of this crisis, and over time, the Haredi position has changed a lot. And today, even within Haredi society, there's a broad compliance with the regulations. The Haredi streets are today empty, just like other streets. But at the same time, there's still a lingering element of, well, come on, we're going to completely give up on our communal prayers. Let's do it, and we'll try to keep the regulations. But we know, because of the nature of human beings, that this is not going to be enough. We're going to have to keep people at home, because otherwise it's not going to work.
Andy Friedman asked basically the same question. I hope this answered it. But Barbara Diamond says, is no religious leader calling upon the Haredi community to follow the orders? And I think Chief Rabbis Yitzhak Yosef and David Lau have just done it, but maybe this is not enough for the Haredi community.
Right. Well, the chief rabbis are obviously representatives of the state, and they're going to have to fall in line with the state regulations. For Haredim, this is not really a rabbinic leadership. Maybe for some of the more eastern parts, the Sephardi Haredi population, Rabbi Yitzhak Yosef is considered to be a rabbinic leader. But I have to say, even what the chief rabbi said, from my perspective, is not sufficient. What did they say? They say, okay, the synagogues now have to be closed down. But they say, let's close the synagogues, but let's continue to hold communal prayers in the courtyards outside the synagogues. And they say, yeah, it has to be in a small number of people and with social distancing. It's insufficient. It's not going to work. In synagogues next to my home, we have 600 or 700 people coming to synagogue 3 times a day to daven, to pray the morning prayers and the afternoon prayers and the evening prayers. Where are they going to go? We can't fit them into the courtyard of the synagogue. The rabbinic instruction has to be much more extreme. It has to be stay at home, pray at home. And that we're not hearing yet. And I think that it's really incumbent on the rabbinic leadership to take this responsibility. It's a difficult step because it means somehow falling out of line. Rabbis are reticent, they're reluctant to make this very far-reaching decision of everybody stay at home, don't leave your homes. This is a far-reaching decision. There are some rabbis who have been prepared to say this, but I guess the most centralized rabbinic leadership is obviously a vast range. There's the Hasidic rabbis and there's the Lithuanian leadership, and even there we have different subgroups within the Lithuanian leadership and so on. So there's a lot of leaders here, but because the Haredi population will not automatically listen to the state regulation, because they need to have this agency of the rabbinic leaders. So I think this is really a a moment of trial for rabbinic Haredi leadership? Will they take this responsibility and simply say, guys, stay at home? That's the call of the moment. God wants to hear our prayers from the home rather than from the synagogues.
Okay, there are two questions. One, somebody asks you to elaborate or to explain what is "V'nishmartem me'od lenafshotechem." I mean, I think there's another term, pikuach nefesh, which means if you follow my statutes and rules, you live by them. I mean, the whole purpose of the rule is...
Pikuach nefesh means danger to life, right? And v'nishmartem me'od lenafshotechem mean we have a directive, a biblical directive, to take every measure that's possible in order to guard our lives. The thing is that, like I mentioned before, Haredi society is very much an establishment, a religious establishment. Now, given that it's a very, I guess, rigid type of religious system, then if you look at halachic material, if you look at the material of Jewish law over the years, this is not the classic case of saving lives. Generally speaking, the issues of pikuach nefesh, of a danger to life, is an immediate issue. There's like an immediate danger of death. Somebody is in danger of being bitten by a snake or in danger of being shot by a rifle. The questions of a plague of this type are rare in rabbinic literature. It's not that they're non-existent. We had cholera plagues in the 19th century. There were cholera plagues, epidemics. We had the Black Plague in the 14th century. But the means of dealing with those plagues were, of course, completely different to the means that we have today. And therefore, there's a lack of formal rabbinic literature concerning this type of case. And therefore, there's a need to defer to the medical practitioners of today, and specifically to the directives of the health ministry and so on. Now, that deferral, that being able, a readiness to simply accept whatever it is that the health ministry says, is something which is, like I said before, difficult for Haredi society. Haredi society says, yeah, well, you know, the health ministry has its considerations. It has its way of weighing things up. It has its own scales, but we have a different set of considerations. It's because they don't see themselves as being one body with the entirety of Israel. So they say, okay, that's what they decided, but now we need to make our own decisions. And you'll see certain rabbinic councils in Bnei Brak and in Modi'in Illit, in Kiryat Sefer, and in Beitar Illit, and in all of these large Haredi concentrations.
Ramat Bet Shemesh.
And in Beit Shemesh, to a degree, Beit Shemesh depends where, but they're a little bit more moderate than some of the other places. But they'll say, okay, we're getting together as rabbis. We'll bring in our own doctors. We'll bring in our own medical professionals, and we'll come to our rabbinic decision. And this is something which I think maybe there was a time for that 3 weeks ago. Today, there's just no space for this whatsoever. It's now a time to take this responsibility and to understand this is not a them and us issue. It's not Israel and the Haredim. It's all of us together. You know, we live and die together in this country. And this is like a state of emergency or a state of war, which really calls for a situation of unity.
Is the fact that the Minister of Health is himself Haredi problematic? And did he do something, except for trying to exclude the synagogues, to convince the Haredi community to comply? This is a question of Pierre Heumann.
Well, yes. First of all, the health minister, Litzman, on the one hand, we have to give him some credit, because from the beginning, he has been a force, within Haredi society of trying to implement the regulations to the degree that's possible. He said all the way at the beginning that people who are, for example, in quarantine are not allowed to come to shul. Some rabbis said, well, you have to be quarantined, but if you need now to hear Megillat Esther, then you can, drop into shul, and it's not so bad. And Litzman said, he called up these rabbis and he says, come on, you can't do this. If that's a regulation, then we have to be a part of it. At the same time, he's also been a force in trying to mitigate those regulations in order to avoid, or in order that the regulations should not be too great a disturbance to the Haredi way of life. I think today that's over. I think now that's over. But broadly speaking, he's played this dual role. On the one hand, as a part of the health ministry, he's been trying to enforce those regulations. He's been trying to convince, to persuade Haredi individuals to comply with the regulations, while on the other hand, trying to mitigate their effect on the integrity of Haredi society.
There's a question by Andy Friedman, who says that during the second Intifada, the IDF was forced to take extreme measures to protect Israelis from Palestinian suicide bombers. Is there any analogy that you need to quarantine or close down areas which surely are problematic?
Well, I would, again, it's a harsh analogy. I would say that currently the situation in Haredi concentrations is not dire, meaning, to my knowledge, and knowledge is limited here because we only have I only have the statistics that have been made public. I don't have anything more than that. But to my knowledge, there is the level of spread of this pandemic in Haredi concentrations is not significantly higher than that of non-Haredi concentrations. I'm not sure that's true. I'm just saying that that's to the best of my knowledge. So I don't think we've reached a state of affairs where we need to bring the army in to prevent Haredim from leaving their neighborhoods and so on. But the truth of the matter is that given the new regulations that are being publicized today, so no one is really allowed to leave their homes. No one is really allowed to cross into different neighborhoods or to go into different areas of Israel. And the truth of the matter is that, generally speaking, Haredi society sticks to itself. Haredim, obviously sometimes they come to the interior ministry to take out a passport. Sometimes they go to the doctor for an appointment, or they go to hospitals and so on. But broadly speaking, they live in Haredi enclaves. They live in Haredi concentrations. And therefore, the question of, is Haredi society going to present a serious risk to the rest of Israel is a question. I don't take it lightly, but I don't think we're there yet.
Okay, last question before we wrap up. In November 2018, there was the measles plague in America, New York, Florida, etc. And there were allegations that the Haredis were not willing to take the vaccines, which caused a lot of hostility toward them. You think that there's something of the sort might happen here, where Israel will look at the Haredi community as a enemy of the society?
Right. Well, I don't know if enemy is the word that I would use, but certainly I'm very concerned about the possibility that coronavirus will be more widespread among Haredim than the rest of Israel, and this will cause a lot of friction and animosity. I think that's already being caused to a significant degree in New York, where there's a lot of anti-Semitism because of the Haredi concentrations of the breakout of coronavirus. And of course, I'm concerned that a similar situation shouldn't happen here. But before that concern, I'm actually just concerned for our health, meaning, I think first and foremost, our concern is to mitigate, to limit, to curb to the degree that we can the spread of the virus. And that requires a complete compliance with the regulation. The Chazon Ish, one of the great leaders of Haredi society when the state was established, he addressed the question of turning off lights in a city where there's a concern for the Germans bombing the city at night. And the question was, can you turn off your lights on Friday night, which is a violation of Shabbat? You're desecrating Shabbat by turning off the lights. And then, the point that he was making was, if the general policy of the city is that we're turning off the lights because there's a danger of being bombed by the Germans, then no individual has a right to take this matter into his own hands, because by taking it into his own hands, he's not affecting himself, he's not just endangering himself, he's endangering the entire city.
It's also the issue of not provoking the going.
Well, that's certainly true in America, of not provoking the going. But, you know, I think the most basic issue is this thinking of...
I think we lost the Rabbi.
I've been muted. You have muted me.
Oh, sorry about that. Go on,
oh,
please.
I've been unmuted. I was starting to write on the chat. So, you know, it's the
Shabak. It's the Shabak monitoring.
I'm being tracked. I know I'm being tracked. That's why I'm very cautious with my words here. You know, first and foremost, let's really internalize this basic understanding that it's our health and the health of the entire people, the entire nation, which is contingent on compliance with the regulation, number one. Number two, let's think about the broader repercussions, like you're saying, the animosity, the potential friction, the potential anti-Semitism that might be caused because of the effects or the secondary effects of non-compliance with the regulations.
Rabbi Pfeffer, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us and for your enlightening presentation. Thank you all for joining. Stay tuned to tomorrow, 4 p.m. We run our next webinar with Mohammed Darawshi of Givat Haviva on the Israeli Arabs under the coronavirus, public health and politics.